So what is the philosophy of Vladimir Putin, and why is he doing this? Well, many of us know of Alexander Dugin and his influence on Putin, and I may do a video later on about him, but very few know of another philosopher that Putin is inspired by, and that is Ivan Ilyin. Now, Ivan Ilyin was alive between 1883 and 1954, and he was a Russian political philosopher who promoted a nationalist and authoritarian vision for Russia. His philosophy centered on the belief that Russia was a unique, spiritually superior nation with a sacred mission to defend its values against external threats, particularly from Europe and the West. Ilyin saw Russia's political and spiritual salvation in the strong, centralized rule of a charismatic leader who would embody and protect the nation's essence. So he was absolutely a fascist and believed in authoritarianism. He advocated for a strong, centralized, state-led government that was helmed by an absolute and unchallenged leader. He believed that the nation's salvation and the protection of its spiritual essence could only be achieved through the rule of this charismatic and powerful leader, not through any kind of democratic process. He subscribed to what the Nazi Germany called the Führerprinzip, which is the leader principle, the head of the Russian empire by a singular person that was ordained by God. Now, I'll get more into this religious aspect in a bit. He also was very nationalistic. Ilyin placed strong emphasis on the importance of the national unity of Russia and shared a sense of purpose among the Russian people. He promoted the notion of a Russian idea or a set of core values that should guide the nation and how it deals with itself as well as everyone around the world. The focus on this national identity and the need for a strong, homogenous nation resonates with that similar fascist ideology. We saw that in Nazism, actually. He was very anti-democratic, anti-liberal in the classical sense. Ilyin was critical of liberal democracies and their associated ideas, such as individual rights, political pluralism, and parliamentary government. He considered these ideas to be a threat to Russia's spiritual essence and the national unity that he continued to talk about, as they could lead to this fragmentation and a moral decay. And I'll get more on this moral decay later on. He is very heavy into this, and it has heavily influenced Putin. His disdain for liberal democracy is very common again with fascism. He had these very fascist thoughts. Interestingly, he was also anti-communist. Ilyin was critical of communism and its worldviews because he saw it as a threat to Russia's spiritual essence. He regarded communism as alien and destructive to what would be the religious underpinnings of the Russian Federation. He believed that communism and its atheist roots undermined what was needed was a absolute ruler, not a ruler by the people, but an absolute fascist ruler. And again, this is someone Putin subscribes to. Ivan Ilyin believed that the Russian leaders, such as Putin, had a sacred mission to protect and preserve the spiritual essence of Russia, which was rooted in the Russian Orthodoxy. This belief in the leader's divine mission is rooted in the concept of the, quote, sacred ruler. He talks about this in his philosophies, the sacred ruler, and it has become part of Russian political thought and culture as of late. Ilyin argued that the ideal Russian leader should be guided by its deep understanding of Russia's spiritual mission and a strong commitment to the well-being of the nation. In this sense, the leader could be seen as a representative of God, entrusted with the responsibility to protect and defend Russia's spiritual essence against external threats and, again, moral decay. Now, the view of the leader's divine mission was also tied to Ilyin's belief in the importance of national unity and the role of the Russian people in maintaining their spiritual essence. It doesn't matter how downtrodden they became. It doesn't matter how painful life in Russia became. If you were still spiritually tied to the Russian people or the Russian nation as a whole, you were still tied to the Russian leader who was the sacred ruler, then you were going to find salvation. Now, Putin is seen as this unifying figure who could help the nation preserve its spiritual strength and fulfill this divine purpose. At least that's what Putin sees himself as. And therefore, Putin has taken several actions during his tenure to align with Ivan Ilyin's views of a centralized fascist male figurehead that frees the people from their everyday decisions by controlling their lives under the shroud of being ordained by God. These include Putin's centralization of power and suppression of dissent. Putin's government has systematically curtailed political freedoms and cracked down on opposition figures. High-profile cases include the arrest and poisoning of opposition leader Alexei Navalny, as well as the assassination of journalists who are critical of Putin's regime, as well as oligarchs who are critical of Putin's regime. These actions reflect Ilin's belief that a strong centralized state led by an unchallenged leader who, no matter what he does, is infallible because he is ordained by God and God himself is infallible. Putin also promotes the traditional values of the Russian Orthodoxy. Putin has supported repressive policies targeting the LGBTQ community, as well as enacting the gay propaganda law, which align with Ilin's emphasis on traditional values and the Russian Orthodoxy as a means to preserve Russia's spiritual essence. I keep going back to this spiritual essence. His annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the latest fighting in Ukraine shows a widely held belief that Russia can assert its influence in a region to protect what is called the Russian world, echoing Ilin's views on the importance of national unity and a shared purpose. So Putin believes Ukraine is a part of the Russian world, and I'll talk a bit about this. His interventions in eastern Ukraine and support for pro-Russian separatists, including providing military and logistics assistance and invading, further highlights his willingness to employ force to protect ethnic Russians and Russian speakers. This intervention aligns with Ilin's call for that strong national unity. Putin's disinformation campaigns and cyber warfare have impacted multiple countries, including Western democracies, including the U.S., and influences on various elections, including the 2016 presidential election and attempts in the 2020 election. These actions aim to undermine the Western democratic institutions and portray Russia as a counterweight to Western liberalism, which reflects Ilin's views on concerns about the threats posed by external forces to Russia and Russia's spiritual essence. Now, Ilin's ideas have been instrumental in shaping Putin's political identity. The regime has used the politics of eternity, which was discussed in a book I'm reading called The Road to Unfreedom by Timothy Snyder. It's absolutely fascinating. You should read it. I'll do a review on my website for it a little bit later when I finish it. But he talks about this politics of eternity where they glorify Russia's past, emphasize its status as a victim of historical injustice, and asserts Russia's exceptionalism. This narrative has allowed Putin to consolidate the power, undermine democratic institutions, and justify aggressive actions on the international stage. His elections have largely been complete shams. He has been put in place, and a lot of his lackeys in other countries, such as Yanukovych in Ukraine, conducted votes that were flat out illegal and used their influence and power to remain in power in their countries, although Yanukovych was obviously deposed in the Maidan revolution. But moving on, and this is likely going to be a multi-parter. The connection between Russian President Vladimir Putin and Ivan Ilyin can be seen in the ways Putin has incorporated Ilin's ideas into his political strategy and use them to justify his actions both within Russia and on the international stage, specifically in Ukraine. The emphasis on Russian exceptionalism is something Ilyin believed that Russia was unique in, and it was spiritually superior to other nations, and it had a distinct identity that needed protection from external threats, particularly the West. Putin has embraced this concept of Russian exceptionalism and asserted that Russia has its own values and traditions that must be defended against Western influence. This has allowed Putin to position himself as the guardian of Russian identity across the world and a bulwark against perceived encroachments on Russian sovereignty, which include absolutely nonsensical beliefs that NATO's bringing countries in that were former Soviet nations is technically an encroachment on Russian sovereignty, because they believe, both Ilyin and Putin believe, that Russia owns those countries. So, and I'm running out of time, so part 2 is coming next. So in part 1 of this one, I left off where I was talking about how Putin is incorporating the philosopher Ivan Ilyin's views into his political strategy across the domestic policy of Russia as well as international foreign policy. And I left off with an emphasis on Russian exceptionalism, where Ilyin and Putin believe that Russia is a unique nation. It's spiritually superior. It needs to protect all Russians from the external threats to that identity and spiritual superiority, specifically aimed at the West. And this is why he's invaded places like Georgia and Moldova and Ukraine, and why he has his sights set on other countries. Putin believes he is guarding all of Russia and its spiritually superior ideology against encroachments on its sovereignty. The second thing here is he centralized power and maintains strong leadership through this centralized power. And Ilyin's philosophy stressed the importance of a strong centralized government led by a charismatic leader who embodies the nation's essence. Putin has taken on this role by consolidating power in his own hands. Essentially, we haven't seen a truly free election that can be verifiably confirmed under the Russian system. There's been massive amounts of evidence showing Putin's ability to manipulate elections, not only in his own country, obviously, but across the world. So Putin has taken this power consolidation, dismantled the democratic institutions that were originally intended under Boris Yeltsin's reign, and reversed them. He then suppressed dissent to this. That's an absolutely fascist tactic. Again, as I said in my previous video in part 1, I talked about the fascism of Ilyin. So by presenting himself as the only leader capable of guiding Russia through these turbulent times, Putin has been able to maintain a firm grip on power and stifle opposition. He creates threats that are not threats. On paper, the greatest threat externally to Russia, other than their internal strife, is likely China. But when you have to address the actual threats in the room, it makes you look weak. So you have to manufacture threats that give you the ability to solve those threats. And that's what Putin is doing. He does that with the West. He knows that NATO and the United States actually really pose no true threat, that we have no offensive aspirations against Russia. But he must create these threats and able to maintain a firm grip on power while also attaching any opposition to them as Western influence. It's not that his administration is all messed up and it's not and completely fallible in how it's operating because it is fascist. It is the Western influence. It is them, they, that is influencing the Russian people to do these things. And so we must address that. It is homosexuality and influencing the youth. In fact, they go so far as to talk about how the AIDS epidemic was brought to Russia on purpose in order to kill the Russian people. This kind of ideology of the pure Russian spirit, the pure history of Russia, which they whitewash heavily, obviously, against the evil West, plays out over and over and over again. And we see this now in the media of Russia. He also manipulates history, which is something that Ilyin had no problem with. Ilyin's ideas provided a framework for Putin to manipulate the history and to serve his political agenda. Ilyin believed that history that didn't serve God's purpose, and even up to and including facts on what actually happened, are not truly facts. They are manifestations of evil and therefore should be discounted whether they are true or not. So that is why you see this elimination of the history, the brutal history of Russia, why you see the elevation of Stalin, but not Bolshevism. And I can kind of talk about Bolshevism in a bit. By cherry-picking events from Russia's past, Putin has created a narrative that glorifies Russia's historical achievements, but also emphasizes its victimhood and justifies its aggressive action on the world stage because everyone is an enemy to them and they're always a victim, and they're this great, glorious, pure nation that is just defending himself under the blanket umbrella of God's blessings. So this selective interpretation of history allows Putin to bolster his own legitimacy, and it stokes nationalism amongst the population. From a foreign policy perspective, Putin and Ilín's philosophy seeks to assert Russian influence and counterbalance Western power. They invoke ideas of justifying external actions such as annexing Crimea or invading Ukraine or Georgia or Moldova or influencing elections or conducting misinformation campaigns on social media to try and get people to believe Brexit was a good idea, to get people to believe certain candidates, to fuel the fire of separatist movements within countries to create cracks. This is all things that really take place, and we fall for them constantly. It's unfortunate. But he provides support for authoritarian regimes. You see this in Belarus with Lukashenko. You saw this with Yanukovych in Ukraine. And he sees these as necessary steps to defend Russia's interests and protect its unique identity. Ilín and many other philosophers believed eventually Europe would need to be broken down into a series of fascist states that all deferred or were absorbed into Russia's sphere of influence, or Russia itself as a part of Russia. This is something Putin actually believes. And you know how I know he believes this? Putin actively promotes Ilín's works and ideas today. He ensures their prominence in contemporary Russian political discourse. There are documentaries in which Ivan Ilín is the hero at the end of the story. Russia has had state-sponsored publications of Ilín's books. There's been organized conferences dedicated to his thought, and he's even moved Ilín's remains to Russia for a reburial ceremony, which was attended by high-ranking officials. Putin absolutely promotes and adores Ivan Ilín's work, and Ivan Ilín is a fascist philosopher. Putin's own political agendas have reinforced and been buttressed by Ilín's views. And it must be noted that Ilín appreciated Nazi fascism methodology. He appreciated how the Nazis exerted power. However, on the flip side, he also hated Bolshevism and hated the communist ideology that arose from the Russian Revolution. He saw communism as materialistic in nature, in which people shouldn't be worried about equally getting what's theirs. They should be worried about, doesn't matter what you get, as long as you defer to God. That is your station in life, whether you're poor, whether you're rich, whether you're an oligarch, whether you're a peasant, doesn't matter. You, in your station, defer always to God, which by proxy means you defer always to the sacred leader, which at this point is what Putin believes he is. He believed, both Ilín and Putin believed, Bolshevism led to moral decay, social fragmentation, and an erosion of traditional values. Putin detested the chaos and atheism and destruction wrought by the Bolshevik Revolution, but appreciated the national unity it caused and consolidation under one leader it caused as well. Interestingly, it was these anti-communist stances that Ilín was actually expelled from the Soviet Union in 1922 because he ran counter to the Bolshevik ideology and communism. So he left in 1922, died overseas, and ended up being repatriated his remains in Russia in a big ceremony by Vladimir Putin. And this looks like it's going to need a part 3. So we'll continue to part 3 here in a bit. So in part 1 and 2, I've been talking about how Putin is heavily influenced by Ivan Ilín, a very fascist-minded philosopher, and how Putin has taken steps to incorporate Ilín's philosophy in his policies, whether it's domestic or foreign policies. And if you need a refresher, please go back and see those. But where we left off was how Putin and Ivan Ilín are now doing whatever it takes to stop the, quote, moral decay, or at least in Putin's case, maybe just using moral decay as an excuse to serve the purposes of advancing Russia as the bastion of superiority across the globe. Some of these examples of Putin taking a stance like Eileen against moral decay include the gay propaganda law in 2013. This law bans the promotion of non-traditional sexual relationships among minors, effectively criminalizing the dissemination of information about the LGBTQ community, issues a broad decree against the rights of young people to view, to experience, or to talk about even their ideologies of where they're at, whether they're gay, whether they're bi, whether they're trans, etc. That criminalizes it within Russia. It's largely been criticized for stigmatizing and marginalizing the LGBTQ community and for promoting discrimination and actually violence against them. They've been jailed for merely talking about potential gay feelings they have. The second thing is the blasphemy law. This law criminalizes acts that insult religious beliefs or outrageous religious feelings. Offenders can face fines, community service, or imprisonment of up to 3 years for just insulting someone's religious beliefs, especially the Russian Orthodoxy. Critics argue that the law is vague and can be used to suppress freedom and expression and dissent. In 2019, Putin enacted the Internet Censorship and Sovereign Internet Law, which is a series of multiple laws actually aimed at regulating and controlling online content, including blocking websites that promote extremism under their views, which in the past have shown things like they consider extremism to be any kind of drug use or drug use hotlines that help out people who are addicts. Any kind of suicide messages, whether it's cries for help, those can be criminalized, or any content, quote, deemed harmful to public morals. That's quite vague and quite subjective. The Sovereign Internet Law seeks to create a national internet infrastructure that can function independently from the global internet. Sound familiar? It sounds like North Korea, doesn't it? Giving the government more control over online content and communications. Therefore, Putin, as the sacred ruler, can promote his sacred message and talk about these sacred ideas. Laws restricting non-governmental organizations and foreign agents came out. These laws require non-governmental organizations that receive foreign funding and engage in political activities, whatever that means, it's in quotes, to register as foreign agents. The legislation has been criticized for suppressing civil society and targeting organizations that promote human rights, environmental protection, and other issues deemed contrary to Putin's traditional values agenda. So again, Putin has to be seen as infallible. You can't go against him. So you need to eliminate these organizations that are saying things like, hey, you're not promoting human rights. This is absolutely against what we would see as proper and normal human rights. Even from environmental protections, it's not the environment. There's no necessarily Mother Earth. It is God that is protecting. So when there's an environmental protection need, one, it goes against the idea that God is all powerful protecting Earth, but it also creates this idea that if you're ruining the environment, you can't continue to be infallible. And then finally, it just makes more money when you don't have to deal with environmental protections. And then he made amendments to the family code, in which Putin signed the amendments to the Russian family code that, among other things, prohibits adoption of Russian children by any same-sex couples or transgender individuals, which is yet another attempt to marginalize the LGBTQ community. Now, it's also kind of why in the Russian media we've seen narratives pushed of the sexual deviant, Satan-loving Ukrainians, quote unquote, and the West against the righteous Russia. And it's peddled all the time by the media. We see it on Solovyov's show constantly. But finally, like Putin, Ivan Ilyin saw Ukraine to be an inseparable part of Russian culture and spiritual space, sharing a common history, religion, and destiny with Russia, which is actually not true. They actually have a separate and quite well-documented culture and identity and language from Russia. But that is whitewashed from history. He viewed the division, both him and Putin viewed the division of the Slavic people across all of Eastern Europe or wherever they are in the world as a tragedy and a potential threat to Russia's spiritual essence and an existential threat. To Aline, the idea of a separate Ukrainian nation was an artificial construct promoted by external forces seeking to weaken Russia, and it is God's will to not only reunify Ukraine and Russia by force if necessary, but also expand to the greatest extent Russia can, because it is the chosen country. Again, Putin believes this, and he is that leader. If we do not stop him, he will continue. And if you don't believe me that Putin doesn't think he is God's ordained leader to take Russia into this future promised land, you only need to look at this card portraying him as a saint passed out to soldiers and people all over Russia.